Hello, everybody. Last week we lectured on the topic of decision structures. This week we're going to lecture on another type of structure referred to as repetition structures. This is also called loops. This is basically the idea of repeating a task a certain number of times, which is quite useful when you write computer programs. The goals of this lecture include learning the three types of loops that are available in processing, namely the while loop, the for loop, and the do while loop. And we're going to study them in that order. And then also to learn how to avoid problems in iteration and iteration errors, namely the infinite loop error, which means you never want your loop to go on for forever. You actually want to have a stopping point. If you have a loop going on forever, it's referred to as an infinite loop. Usually ends with your program being non-responsive or crashing. If you recall, an algorithm needs to be terminating. So if you have an infinite loop, it's not terminating, it's not a valid algorithm, and also it won't function properly. The other type of error is the off by one error, and this is basically a counting error as you're going through the loops. So we're going to talk about this more as well. And lastly, we're going to talk about nested loops. Nested loops are just as it was the case with nested if and else statements, is having loops inside of other loops, which is going to be quite interesting and quite useful. So that's our agenda for this week. The area of control structures in programming is quite interesting. So anytime you have a non-trivial program, you need to have control structures. Control structures could be selection structures, such as if else statements, which we did already last week. They could be repetition structures, and we're going to cover them this week, such as the while loop. Or they could be jump structures, which we're also going to cover this week, but not so much. They're not a big part of the course, such as break statements. So this is what we are concentrating this week in terms of control structures. So what is a loop? It's basically a code block that repeats, and first of all, each iteration does something different. So it would be pretty useless if you had a loop. You could have a loop that keeps on repeating itself and doesn't, so it keeps on doing the same thing, and there are no changes. That's kind of useless. Also, it must have a condition to stop, otherwise it would be an infinite loop, which is also useless. Now you have already learned loops technically through the draw function, but of course the draw function is mostly used for drawing. There are subtle differences between the loops that we're going to learn and the draw function. There are a couple of advantages to learning loops and using loops. First of all, you have 100% control over your loops, whereas you don't have 100% control over the draw function. Recall that the draw has that invisible line, so it does things that are transparent to the programmer. The draw function is specific to processing, so if you ever wanted to program in C++ or Java, there is no such a thing as the draw function looping for you. So learning these loops is going to be quite useful because they're the same everywhere. And like I said, you're going to have more control over these loops, and you could do some really cool things with them, which you can't do with a draw function. All right. A repetition structure. So let's get a formal definition for this. A repetition structure, i.e. a loop, is a control structure that allows a program to run a statement or a series of statements repetitively, as long as a certain test condition is true. So first of all, we get a program that it's a control structure. So this is really important, that allows the program to run one statement or series of statements repetitively as long as a test condition is true. So this is quite important. Loop has a condition, quite important, and a loop block. The loop block, also called the body of the loop. So this should be quite familiar for you from the lectures on if statements. So the block is confined between the two braces, exactly like the if statements were. And the braces are not required if the body is composed of only one statement. So all the rules that you learned with the decision structures, such as the if statement, still apply here, except that the if statement only happens once. The loops keep on repeating based on that test condition. So we're going to go into this in a lot of detail now. Three types of loops, as we said: while, for, and do while. And we're going to start talking about the while loop now. Just before, so this is an example of a while loop, but just before I start talking about these loops, all three of them, they have three things in common. They have an initialization expression. They will have a test expression to control the stoppage of the loop, and they have an updating expression that helps in helps in reaching the condition of the loop. For the while loop, the structure will look like this, where you would initialize, you would test, and you would have your statements as well as your updating expression. And if you notice, here is the block of, so let's take that one out. This is the block of your while loop. So actually the way the while loop or any other loop will operate is that you're going to have this condition, or also known as the test expression. And if it is deemed to be true, so let me actually just erase this. So if this is true, you're going to execute the statements inside. And then after executing the statements inside the block, you're going to go back to the top, test to see if the test condition is true. If it's true, you'll go and re-execute everything in there. If it's false, you would simply drop out of the loop and go and execute everything else. So let's start talking about this. We're going to start by talking about the while loop.